Good morning, and thank you for joining us. My name is Hisham Salem. I am the Associate Director of the Program in Arab Reform and Democracy at the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law at Stanford. I would like to welcome you all today to our event titled Islamists and the Arab Uprisings. Before I introduce our speaker, Abdullah Al-Arian, I would like to take a moment to recognize our co-sponsors, the Abbasi Program in Islamic Studies here at Stanford, the 10 Years On Project. To learn more about the 10 Years On Project, please visit the arabuprisings.org. And finally, I just want to take a moment to recognize the Arab Studies Institute and Jadadiyya, and especially my colleague Layla Nashashibi for all her efforts in making the live streaming of this talk possible on Facebook, specifically on Jadadiyya's Facebook page. Really thankful for her support. And our speaker today is my longtime friend, colleague, and my classmate from Georgetown. I'm not going to say how long ago that was for both of our sakes. Abdullah Al-Arian, who is an associate professor of history at Georgetown University in Qatar. He specializes in the study of the modern Middle East and Islamic social movements. He is author of one of my favorite books, Answering the Call, which is something we don't do enough of when you can think about it, Abdullah, right? With all the WhatsApping and all the texting, but it's not about that at all, actually. The full title, one of my favorite books, Answering the Call, Popular Islamic Activism in Sadat's Egypt, which was published by Oxford University Press, I believe in 2014, am I right, Abdullah? And his upcoming book compares the historical experiences of Islamist movements in 6 different Arab states. You heard that correctly, 6 different Arab states. That manuscript is due to be published by Cambridge University Press. Abdullah is also the editor of the Critical Currents in Islam page on Jadadiyya. Abdullah, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you so much. So first of all, thank you to the Center on Democracy Development and the Rule of Law for the kind invitation. Obviously, I would have loved to be there in person, but I know we're not quite there yet with the pandemic. Thank you also to the 10 Years On Project. I've attended nearly all of the events that they've held this year in commemoration of the decades since the Arab Uprisings. They've been incredibly illuminating, so I encourage everyone joining us to go back and check out those previous sessions. I'm honored to be adding my own contribution here today. I also want to start by remembering our beloved teacher and mentor, Michael Hudson, who passed away earlier this week. It is a bit fitting that Hisham and I have reconnected for today's event, because when we were recalling recently that we first met while doing our coursework at Georgetown, it was in fact in a course entitled International Politics of the Middle East. Professor Hudson was so instrumental in our intellectual development. We recall his kindness and generosity of spirit and his commitment to sharing his platform with those whose voices often went unrepresented. He'll be sorely missed, but his contributions live on, particularly through those of us who are fortunate enough to call ourselves his students. So the subject of today's talk is Islamists and the Arab Uprisings. And as we sit here more than 10 years since the launch of the mass protests, discussions on this topic are more often than not colored by the outcomes of the protest movements, political transitions, and civil conflicts. So to begin with, I would make the simple point that to focus on outcomes as opposed to process presents severe limitations in our ability to analyze these forces at work. The perception regarding the dwindling or diminished role of Islamist politics is largely informed by the destructive civil wars in Syria, Libya, and Yemen, the authoritarian resurgence in Egypt, and the scorched earth policy toward Islamist currents by the regimes of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and their allies. Even Tunisia's supposed success with Islamist political integration has been tempered by the frustrations brought on by structural continuities from the former regime, coupled with periodic political crises that have threatened to undo the gains of Tunisia's revolutionary transition. Nevertheless, narratives surrounding Islamist defeat or retreat tend to obscure rather than clarify how we understand their role in the uprisings and what we may expect from them going forward. So now, if you'd indulge me, I'd like to take us back in time a decade. By the end of 2011, Zain al-Abidin bin Ali of Tunisia and Hosni Mubarak of Egypt had been overthrown by mass uprisings in their respective countries. The regimes of Ali Abdullah Saleh of Yemen and Muammar Gaddafi of Libya had totally collapsed. Bashar al-Assad was facing the largest threat to his rule in the form of a largely peaceful protest movement that had been ruthlessly repressed and had begun to respond in kind. The monarchical rulers of Jordan, Morocco, and Bahrain had similarly witnessed popular mobilizations in the form of ordinary citizens demanding the restoration of their dignity and the recognition of their collective rights. In short, scholars, journalists, and citizen observers alike, both within the Arab region and across the world, were witnessing what they believed to be the dawn of a new era in the Middle East, one signified by an end to dictatorship and the rise of representative governments, equal citizenship, and respect for the rule of law. But no sooner had the discussions about the post-authoritarian transition to democracy emerged that the conversation shifted once again. This time to the question of what role Islamist movements would play in nation states freed from the top-down imposition of secularism. Some critics warned that the vacuum left by secular authoritarian rulers would simply be filled by a new tyranny in the form of political Islam. As political parties representing the Muslim Brotherhood school of thought popped up in one country after another and proved to be the social movement most capable of exploiting the country's massive political opening, the Arab Spring, it was suggested, would give way to an Islamist winter, in which these parties undermined notions of national citizenship and eroded state borders, culminating in the unification of Muslim Brotherhood movements from Morocco to Yemen, and perhaps even bringing about the restoration of the caliphate. There was a lot of hyperbole in those days, probably still is. Of course, anyone who closely followed the post-uprising developments in places like Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, and Yemen knew this to be a complete fallacy. Parties like the Ennahda movement in Tunisia, the Freedom and Justice Party in Egypt, the Justice and Construction Party in Libya, and the Islah Party in Yemen were far more focused on their respective domestic affairs than on fulfilling the goals of some abstract transnational ideological and political project. In fact, the posture of these parties during those critical years has only confirmed what has been plain to see for some time. Traditional Islamist groups that emerged out of the Muslim Brotherhood school of thought have adapted their missions to their local political and socioeconomic contexts. This brings me to my second point. There was a tendency by many observers who addressed the role of Islamists throughout the uprisings to present their analysis largely in light of the events of the uprisings themselves. In other words, the posture of Islamist political actors was measured largely in relation to the changing contours of the uprisings, including perceived moments of national unity and mass mobilization, narrow political openings offered by the transitions, and the closures of those avenues for participation resulting from foreign interventions and counter-revolutionary reprisals. In examining the role of Islamists in the Arab uprisings, I prefer to take a long historical approach that positions these developments as a product of processes that have been at work for over half a century. These relate primarily to Islamist interactions with nationalism and the state, positions that have evolved not only in a purely ideological sense, but in the course of the movement's activism and mobilization strategies. I should mention here that this analysis stems from research conducted for my upcoming book, tentatively titled Nations of Brothers, which investigates the dual process of localization and nationalization of the Muslim Brotherhood mission from its origins in interwar Egypt to 6 Arab contexts, those being Sudan, Syria, Jordan, Palestine, Kuwait, and Tunisia. Each chapter of the book tells a story of the localization of Islamic activism in the mid-20th century, rooting each case in the historical interactions between local Islamic institutions and practices, the era of colonial rule, and the subsequent experiences with nationalism and state formation that defined much of the official histories of the 20th century in the Arab region. The study then identifies the numerous ways in which the era of decolonization and the establishment of centralized state institutions with modern instruments of control impacted the development of Islamist intellectual and activist currents. The study puts forward the argument that the Muslim Brotherhood as a specific brand of Islamism with roots in the early 20th century Islamic modernist tradition should be treated as a nationalist force whose activist mission cannot be viewed in isolation from the broader developments within the state building projects of the Middle East. What I'm suggesting essentially is to write Islamists back into the nationalist histories of Arab states. Now, there are a number of reasons why these expressions of Islamism have been largely excluded from nationalist narratives across the region. Unfortunately, I don't have the time to address them fully here, but I'll mention them quickly. The first reason is conceptual. That is, the ways in which scholars have defined nationalism has tended to exclude movements or ideologies that place religious identity at the core of their program. Secondly, one could point to the historiography of Arab societies that privileges state-centered narratives and has a tendency to marginalize the voices of non-state actors that did not exercise political power during the critical phases of state building and national identity formation. Third, one can look at the posture of the movements themselves, which have historically disavowed any connection to the nationalist movement and developed an ideological program that was committed to countering the dominant nationalist paradigm in their respective contexts. And this is a point which I will have a chance to get to later. A final reason that can be added concerns the geopolitical calculations made by Western powers in the post-colonial era as to what or who constituted a nationalist. And I'd be happy to expand on these points in greater detail during our discussion. But for now, let's move to the question of what constituted the defining characteristics of Islamic movements in the Arab region on the eve of the uprisings. The primary one concerns Islamist claims to spiritual authenticity as the basis for political legitimacy. As we've said, the emergence of these movements was a uniquely 20th century phenomenon. The decline of traditional religious institutions in much of the Islamic world, due to factors that included rapid modernization and imperialism, saw the rise of lay intellectuals and activists who sought to reinvigorate their societies with the ethical norms and traditional values of their Islamic faith. In keeping with the challenges of the time, they also recognized the need to adapt these values to changing social norms and new economic and political realities. The Muslim Brotherhood was conceived not by a religious scholar with formal training in the traditional Islamic sciences, but rather by a school teacher born in an Egyptian village and educated at Cairo's Dar al-Ulum, one of the country's modern institutions of higher learning. Motivated by this perceived crisis of authority, Hassan al-Banna proposed that in the absence of the strong leadership that had traditionally upheld society's moral center, it was now incumbent upon ordinary people to promote Islamic principles, beginning with their families and local communities and expanding outwardly toward the level of the nation. The da'wah, or missionary call to which members subscribed, implored followers to live according to model Islamic behavior and advocate for those values in their schools, businesses, places of work, and other institutions of public life. From that point onward, the Islamic movement developed along two paths, though the two were closely intertwined and often indistinguishable from one another. Along one path lay the da'wah, which manifested in everyday preaching and was helped in part by the development of a robust Islamic media industry in publishing and satellite television, eventually expanding through a massive online presence. In most places where the Muslim Brotherhood spread, it also established charitable associations, schools, medical clinics, and other social institutions, particularly in areas in which state welfare provision was lacking. The other path resulted from the movement's recognition that public preaching and institution building alone were insufficient in promoting its vision for society. Rather, seeing the power that states held over citizens, especially following the emergence of centralized authoritarian and highly bureaucratized regimes, Islamic activists increasingly adopted political platforms that sought inclusion within institutions of state power. During his lifetime, al-Banna was quick to demonstrate how much he had internalized the logic of the modern state. He wrote public letters to the monarch, pressing King Farouk to take action in favor of Islamizing public life. He also challenged the Wafd party in parliamentary elections and even held talks with British colonial officials. Banna's followers would continue to advocate for a political and socioeconomic order that reflected Islamic ethical values. They pushed for censorship of objectionable content in books and films, lobbied banks to forego the use of interest, and demanded that parliament be required to pass laws only in accordance with Islamic legal principles. Later, they would compete for the leadership of student unions and professional syndicates and entered parliamentary elections where possible. But more often than not, and despite their stated commitment to gradual reform, Islamists were largely excluded from the realm of acceptable political actors and subject to the ruthless whims of the state security services. This was particularly true in states like Syria, Iraq, Libya, and Tunisia that transformed into secular military dictatorships in which all independent social movements were totally repressed. In monarchies like Jordan, Bahrain, Kuwait, and Morocco, the Muslim Brotherhood and its offshoots became a fixture of the political landscape, albeit under heavy constraints. Returning to Egypt, though all room for Islamic activism was eliminated during the Nasser era, the movement was revived during the Sadat years and enjoyed a semi-tolerated status in the Mubarak period, when independent candidates representing the Muslim Brotherhood famously won 88 seats, making up 1/5 of the Egyptian parliament in the 2005 elections. But I would argue that the two historical examples that should have been considered more closely in the early stages of the post-uprising transitions were actually those of Algeria and Sudan. Following a brief political opening in 1990, the Islamic Salvation Front contested local, provincial, and national elections, legislative elections, and was poised to win a majority in parliament. With the votes still being counted, the Algerian military intervened, canceling the elections, banning the feast, and arresting its leadership. A civil war ensued in which a number of militant Islamist groups displaced the feast and fought a bloody conflict with the regime that led to the deaths of over 150,000 Algerians. By the end of the decade, the military had crushed what remained of the opposition and extinguished all hopes for an inclusive political system. Meanwhile, in Sudan, since emerging on the scene in the mid-1960s, scholar and activist Hassan al-Turabi developed an experimental model of Islamic activism that alternately tried its hand as a movement of elitist intellectuals, a party of the masses, and a partner to military regimes. The National Islamic Front asserted its Sudanese nationalist character even as it worked to implement the Sharia as part of the Numeri regime's Islamization policies in the early 1980s. Following the failure of that experiment, the NIF backed yet another military leader, this time by quietly sponsoring the coup that brought Omar al-Bashir to power in 1989, making Turabi the most successful Islamist to claim political power in the Sunni world. Soon after, Turabi ordered the dissolution of the Islamic movement and committed all of his energies to exercising political power from within the state until he was ousted following a power struggle with al-Bashir 10 years later. The lessons of these two experiences in the early 1990s would have been instructive to the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and indeed to all Islamists across the region 2 decades later. Simply put, these experiences reflect challenges to Islamic activism on 2 levels: the internal tensions between the social and political missions of the movement and the tensions between the Islamist movement and the structures of the modern state. We'll take a look at both of these in turn, but first let's examine the posture of Islamist groups during the events of the uprising. By the eve of the mass protests, most Islamist movements had adopted a reformist, state-centered approach to their activist missions. The historic uprisings that aimed to topple dictatorships in the name of freedom, dignity, and social justice presented Islamists with both risks and opportunities. On the one hand, as the most organized social movements and ones with a ready-made platform to attract supporters in the form of the dawah and its promise of a more just and ethical society, these groups were in pole position to claim the reins of state power in the transitions to more representative rule. On the other hand, Islamists, for the most part, had no revolutionary credentials and had clearly tailored their politics to be in line with the realities of surviving authoritarian rule. That reluctance was on display in decisions made by the Muslim Brotherhood throughout the uprising. While many youth members participated in the initial January 25th protest in Egypt, they did so against the expressed wishes of the group's senior leadership, which only endorsed the protests 3 days later. Not wanting to commit fully to the course of revolution, the leadership also used the inroads it had made with state officials to negotiate an improved position for itself in the event that the uprising failed to oust the regime. Even after Mubarak's forced removal, the Muslim Brotherhood's newly launched political arm, the Freedom and Justice Party, preferred a gradual and reformist approach to the post-Mubarak transition to a revolutionary and confrontational one. The short-lived presidency of the FJP's Mohammed Morsi was notable not in its power-hungry excesses of which he was falsely accused by critics, but rather for its determination to avoid a head-on clash with the state's most powerful institutions, chiefly the military. When the FJP-authored constitution was passed in late 2012, it enshrined the Egyptian military's privileged status and left it beyond the scope of civilian oversight. Of course, that deferential posture was not enough to spare the Muslim Brotherhood the wrath of the military amid a resurgent authoritarianism in the bloody aftermath of the 2013 coup. But even before its epic collapse and reversion to outlaw status, the Muslim Brotherhood faced a crisis in reconciling its historic social mission with its emerging political ambitions. The unprecedented opening presented a number of burning questions for which the movement had to scramble to find answers that would balance the movement's historical legacy with its growing political ambitions. Would members of the Muslim Brotherhood organization be required to join its political party, or could they express themselves freely within Egypt's nascent multi-party political landscape? Would internal disagreements over matters of policy be tolerated, or would they be viewed as violations of the religiously decreed obligation to hear and obey? السمع والطاعة. Would the FJP's rush to sweep every election it contested during the transition create a conflict between the party and the broader movement, and relatedly between the movement and the nation as a whole? The cracks within the movement, largely kept under wraps in the past, became much more visible in a series of high-profile defections and public debates on the changing nature of Islamic activism in revolutionary times. During the post-Mubarak transition, the Muslim Brotherhood found itself tremendously isolated by continuing to rely exclusively on its traditional base of support, rather than attempt to convince a broader swath of the Egyptian public to support the FJP. It also faced internal resistance for depriving group members the freedom to form their own political preferences. Morsi's candidacy, which reversed a promise made by Muslim Brotherhood leaders not to field a presidential candidate in the 2012 elections, was in part a response to the candidacy of Abdullah Abu Futuh, a former Muslim Brotherhood leader who left the group to pursue his own independent political career. The Morsi presidency, in other words, was at least partially the result of the Muslim Brotherhood's attempt to dispel the notion that the movement's mission could succeed without the organization sustaining it. Let's unpack this a bit. Long before anyone could have envisioned the possibility of a Muslim Brotherhood president of Egypt, in one sense, the Islamic movement found itself trapped between the state and society. On the one hand, it had to contend with the structural limits of pursuing its reformist mission within the confines of a semi-closed authoritarian system that had little tolerance for outside forces, especially one laying claim to moral authority. On the other hand, while it was busy playing politics, a space that required a relatively high degree of compromise, pragmatism, and adaptation, the movement nonetheless needed to maintain those claims to moral authority among its base of support. What the political opening presented by the uprisings essentially did was to force a question that had been bubbling beneath the surface for decades. How could the Islamist movement maintain both its dawah and its dawla, its piety and its politics? As I mentioned earlier, the Sudanese had long ago decided that to pursue state power necessarily entailed severing your links to the movement, an entity which by definition exists outside the realm of the state. So upon reaching the halls of power, Turabi disbanded Sudan's Islamic movement, basically telling its members to go home. But it was the Ennahda party that formalized this process in the wake of Tunisia's uprising. Under the leadership of Rashid al-Ghannouchi, the party had centered its commitment to democracy as the basis for an ethical political order going back to the early 1980s. This commitment to democratic pluralism ensured that Ennahda would avoid the trappings of power during the shaky initial stages of post-authoritarian rule. Even as it won the country's first free elections in 2011, the party insisted on sharing power within a coalition government and stepped down completely following a national crisis in late 2013, perhaps fearing a similar counter-revolution as that which shook Egypt just a few months earlier. Further cementing its accommodationist posture, Ennahda also supported a law that shielded former regime officials from accountability, and then declined to include the Sharia as a source of legislation within the revised Tunisian constitution, abandoning a core Islamist tenet. To free itself from the predictable barrage of internal critiques, at its 2016 party conference, Ennahda leaders formally severed the movement's dawah from its political activities. Likening his party to the Christian Democrats of many European states, Ghannouchi declared, quote, "We are Muslim Democrats who no longer claim to represent political Islam." It's hard to overstate just how monumental a step Ghannouchi's statement represents. In its modest experience as a mainstream political party that has cut ties with its traditional social base and its Islamist ideological roots, Ennahda has put forward a blueprint for Islamist parties to achieve political success on the national stage. The Party of Justice and Development in neighboring Morocco has followed a similar path, distancing itself from the broader religious movement from which it derived much of its support when it formed the government following its electoral success in 2011 and again in 2016. The PJD government has deflected attention from its Islamist roots by pledging to govern within the existing political system, despite the system's structural constraints and hostility to reforms. It's worth emphasizing here how the fixation on formal politics has transformed Islamic activism. We see this not only in cases of modest success like those of Tunisia and Morocco, but also in cases where the uprisings did not result in a more prominent role for Islamist actors. As we witnessed in Algeria 2 decades earlier, The deep commitment by movements to operating within the narrow confines of state institutions meant that in instances where that avenue did not exist, Islamists, and here we're defining them as those stemming from the Muslim Brotherhood school of thought, were quickly sidelined. As events unfolded in Syria, Yemen, and Libya, these parties became either largely irrelevant, overshadowed by more militant Islamist factions, or they became completely dependent on their enlistment in the strategic goals of a Gulf patron, usually Saudi Arabia and or Qatar. And we've seen this particularly in the cases of Syria and Yemen. Another feature of the Islamist participation in the Arab uprisings concerns the expanding space for the definition of national identity. For much of their history, Islamist actors were perceived as being ideologically opposed to all expressions of nationalism. And the very roots of its ideology, the Muslim Brotherhood, disavowed the notion of nationalism as a narrow designation meant to undermine the bonds of Islamic solidarity that transcend artificially constructed physical borders and cultural boundaries. Benna's speeches are replete with references to nationalism as a tool of Western colonialism to carve up and exploit Muslim lands. But despite these initial protestations, in practical terms, the movement quickly embraced national identities in the course of developing and growing its organizational structure, established chapters in Syria, Jordan, Sudan, and elsewhere, demanded their autonomy on an explicitly nationalist basis, and freed themselves from the yoke of Egyptian domination. Their words, not mine. The ideological commitment to opposing nationalism would continue, particularly in the face of the violent repression of secular authoritarian rule. The aggressive attempts by radical nationalist regimes in the second half of the 20th century to force a singular vision of the state and its national character onto their societies was met by the vocal rejection of the Islamist opposition. In fact, I would contend that a primary reason why Islamist groups continued to disavow any nationalist aspirations through the end of the 20th century was due to the fact that national identity formation was purely the domain of secular authoritarians. So in other words, as long as it was Saddam Hussein, Hafiz al-Assad, and Hosni Mubarak who defined what it meant to be Iraqi, Syrian, or Egyptian, these groups simply wanted no part of it. But as soon as the space was created for movements and parties to debate and discuss what it meant to adhere to these national identities, you find these parties enthusiastically involved in the process. If we think back to the opening after Mubarak's fall in February 2011, every event for the Freedom and Justice Party, from press conferences and political rallies to campaign events and street protests, featured the singing of the Egyptian national anthem, the prominent display of Egyptian flags, and other symbols of national identity. The same was true for Islamist parties throughout the region. In the contest over flags in the Syrian case, for instance, the Muslim Brotherhood raised the independence flag as a symbol of the Syrian revolution, a flag that predated Syria's current flag by some 26 years. This was far from an overnight development or an instance of momentary opportunism. Rather, we can trace it back to a process that began in the final decades of the 20th century. The collapse of tightly controlled, centralized national projects on the order of Nasserism ushered in an era in which the state possessed neither the desire nor the means to continue its vast commitments to society. We tend to observe this largely in the realm of social welfare programs, as the state abandoned many of its commitments in the name of privatization and economic liberalization. Islamist movements were among the chief beneficiaries of this opening, particularly in filling the breach left by the state in establishing a robust network of social welfare projects and institutions that serve to enhance the movement's profile and expand its support base. But what we hear about less frequently is the extent to which the neoliberal turn in the region also created conditions whereby the defining lines of national identity, as they manifested in the realms of popular culture, economic relations, and politics, also became sites of intense contestation, so that by mid-2011, the Muslim Brotherhood, and indeed all of Egypt's political currents and factions, could put forward competing visions of what it meant to be Egyptian. Of course, that process was upended by the military coup in Egypt in 2013 and the broader counter-revolutionary wave across the region. So in the time that I have remaining, I'd like to identify a few of the more salient themes to emerge from the developments in the post-uprising era. It's probably too soon to speak definitively of a post-uprising era, but we can at least think in terms of the consequences of this current moment that has seen the displacement and political isolation of most Islamist actors in the region. Perhaps as a survival mechanism, the cataclysmic defeats suffered by Islamist movements at the hands of state and regional security agencies has only further solidified their determination to find acceptance within the region's state structures. The Yemeni and Syrian movements have relied in large part on their service to regional Gulf allies to avoid all-out repression or irrelevance. In Egypt, the post-coup reality and the subsequent dismantling and repression the movement endured has not deterred the Muslim Brotherhood's conservative senior leadership from believing in a path toward reconciliation with the Sisi regime. They envision a future in which they can return to a state of grudging coexistence, not unlike that which defined the movement's relationship with Mubarak. The surviving leadership has other problems to contend with in the form of widespread dissension within the movement's ranks. In the aftermath of the coup, reformist figures, particularly youth factions, many of which have formed in exile, have grown more vocal about the need to sever the organization's political activism from its missionary work. Such a measure, they contend, would preserve the purity of the group's social mission from the murky waters of national politics. Critical to this viewpoint is the demand to disentangle the Muslim Brotherhood's rigid hierarchical and closed organizational structure from its broader social and political missions. Similar efforts have been quietly underway by Islamist parties across the Arab region, the result of major internal as well as external pressures. Such a transformation, complete with the explicit adoption of a nationalist platform, has been deemed necessary for these movements to engage in formal politics in a post-authoritarian order. But unlike the logic behind the Ennahda's decision to sever its dawah from its politics, this view holds that such a move is imperative to the development of a mass movement in order to upend the existing power structure, not cozy up to it. In 1994, French scholar Olivier Roy published a book entitled The Failure of Political Islam. In it, he argued that the inability of the Muslim Brotherhood to offer a true alternative from the post-colonial political structures that emerged in the Arab region constituted a failure of these movements, leading him to declare that rather than Islamism, it is more appropriate to speak of Islamo-nationalism. If we take that argument to its conclusion, the evolution of Ennahda and its integration into the secular Tunisian state system would therefore constitute a dilution of the Ikhwanism to which it had supposedly been beholden. Another way of looking at these developments, though, is that in the same way that Islamists have become nationalized, so too have nationalists attempted to Islamize their agendas in their desperate pursuit of legitimacy. What is truly ironic is that as Islamist parties gradually acquire a more, quote, secular outlook to their interpretation of the needs of contemporary democratic politics, several authoritarian rulers have increasingly begun to employ traditional Islamic arguments to justify their hold on power. Ali Gouma, the former Grand Mufti of Egypt and a vocal supporter of the Sisi regime's brutal crackdown on civilians, has routinely been called upon to justify the emergence of a new authoritarianism in Egypt as the fulfillment of a traditional requirement of classical Islamic jurisprudence to promote political stability and obedience to one's ruler. These pronouncements by Gouma and a coterie of official jurists across the region signify that the debate around Islam and politics has come full circle. The perceived failure of the state's religious establishment to represent the aspirations of believers in the face of tyranny inspired Benna to launch his movement nearly a century ago. But over the course of the past decade, Islamist groups have abandoned Islam as the solution as a simplistic catchphrase in favor of an emphasis on particular values that their evolving interpretation of Islam promotes: freedom, consultative governance, and justice. Indeed, the challenges that the latest iteration of Islamist activism faces are the same ones that confront political parties of all ideological stripes, namely how to ensure that governments represent the interests of the majority of their citizens at a time when more people face the dangers of vast economic inequality and lack basic rights of freedom and security than at any other time in the recent past. Along with the two competing voices for the future of Islamic activism can be added a third, smaller faction made up of disillusioned members on the fringes of the movement, which believes that a traditional Islamist project that is inherently tied to the fate of the modern nation state is doomed to fail. Given the precarious condition of most states in the region and their inability to remedy the critical challenges faced by their citizens, this group argues that seeking to create an Islamically based political order within existing power structures is a futile endeavor. Though small in number and representing mainly an intellectual trend rather than a broad-based movement, This faction maintains that the Muslim Brotherhood's dramatic fall from grace represents a unique opportunity to explore bold new ideas that address the root problems afflicting not only Egyptians, Syrians, and Libyans, but societies throughout the global South: ethno-nationalist and sectarian violence, imperialism, neoliberal economic exploitation and wealth inequality, food insecurity, environmental degradation, and so on. Absent the distraction of competing for political power within the current structure, proponents believe that the Islamic movement, or what's left of it, should construct its mission anew, unencumbered by its ideological tradition or the ever-changing demands of partisan politics. Though it is unlikely to have an impact on events anytime in the near future, the dynamism expressed in these early conversations, occurring largely in exile, is likely to inform the long-term trajectory of Islamist intellectual thought. In the near term, however, it appears that one way or another, the fate of Islamists necessitates their abandonment of long-held beliefs and practices. In the best of cases, successful integration within the narrow confines allowed by some states has demonstrated that nothing short of reconstituting the traditional Islamist mission as a 21st century political party like any other will suffice. That gives little reason for optimism, as the power structures within which these parties operate often leave them detached from their base of support within society, prone to corruption, and forced to compromise the ethical basis around which they formed. Elsewhere, the success of counter-revolutionary forces in stemming the tide of structural change has left Islamist forces out in the cold. The regional project, advanced in large measure by Saudi Arabia and the UAE, along with their local clients, has all but eroded the space for the precarious, though relatively stable coexistence that typified the Islamist experience under authoritarian rule for roughly half a century. As the resurgent dictatorship in Egypt and the destructive civil wars in Syria, Libya, and Yemen aim to consolidate a new authoritarian order, there is little room for popular social movements with political aspirations, whether Islamist or otherwise. These conditions notwithstanding, it is likely that the Islamist idea, so to speak, will endure as a force with broad social appeal and an ability to mobilize populations. The circumstances around which it has occurred may be radically different, but the effect of this recent experience is nonetheless the same: the forced separation of the Islamist movement's core mission from its political activism. Whether this represents the latest stage in the evolution of Islamism as a viable political alternative or spells its demise remains to be seen. Thank you.